It's Colleen Schmidt from Divination Counseling Service here today to present another horary lecture. So we're looking at part 4 of the horary. And so today what we're going to be discussing is the retrograde planets, and we touch upon stationary, what that means and how you would look at that in horary. So before I begin, I want to say that I will be using Karen Haymaker Zondag, her book, because Barbara Waters does not really incorporate the retrogrades, because she actually goes by the old rule, which is that since it's not sun-centered, that the retrogrades wouldn't apply. Now remember that Karen Haymaker is still with us and Barbara is not. So she's an older astrologer. The way that Karen does the rules is very good, not just for the horary, but for astrology, classic astrology in general. So before I begin, as always, I want to thank my subscribers, and I want to encourage everybody to subscribe. I'm particularly loving that we're connecting up with some astrologers and some self-taught astrologers. So I just want to say that I received a beautiful letter from somebody, ED something or other, and from Brazil. And I don't know if you're going to watch this, but I hope you do, because it was a beautiful letter and I went to respond and it was gone. So I wanted you to know, my friend from Brazil, that many of us are self-taught. Since I come from the United States, my first 20 years were self-taught. I was very fortunate that after so many years, I was able to connect up with some really wonderful teachers who really helped get me to another level with my astrology. So I wish you the same good fortune. And to let you know that many astrologers are self-taught. I think that's something that might be a prerequisite sometimes. And I also understand about astrology programming, and it's ironic because instead of upgrading my solar fire, I didn't. I actually bought Janus. So I wanted to put that out there. And thank you so much for that beautiful letter. Whoever you are, I really enjoyed reading it. I enjoyed hearing from you, and you're the exact kind of person I'm hoping that these videos will attract to my channel. Thank you. Thank you for helping this channel to grow, all of you. And thank you for allowing me into your lives. So with that said, I'm working a little differently today, and I'm hoping and crossing my fingers that it'll be more successful. So let's jump in and look at some of the notes that I did on the retrogrades and eventually ending with stationary. And not only that, but if you're new to astrology, the importance of what a stationary versus a retrograde is. And I think that's well worth looking at. So let's step in to my office, if we will, and see what we've got. So we should be looking at my paperwork now, and I'm way down here at the end, and I'll go through all of this because unfortunately when you start pushing buttons, it goes where it goes. But let's look at what horary part 5 is going to be looking at. And one of the things that I started with in this, and I'll probably go into more detail, is that the most important factor is aspects to the moon. And the moon, like the sun, has only one direction. Okay, so they do not ever retrograde, in case you weren't aware of that. However, it does go to moon does go into void, of course, and it's almost when it changes signs. So it's usually right around then. So I wanted you to be aware of that for those who didn't know. But void, of course, as we know from an earlier horary video, is not a great sign or a good, it doesn't work out usually when things are void, of course. And that's true for inception charts. And so let me explain very quickly what an inception chart is, because you're going to be seeing it in our write-up here. An inception chart is a chart at the beginning, like if you're starting a new business, if you're starting a new relationship, it's really wise to do what's referred to as an inception chart, because it can really tell you a lot about what it is that you're looking at, whether it be starting a new job, starting a new relationship, getting married, because that's considered an inception chart. And all of those factors come together and they create, I want to say, a synopsis, if you will, of whatever the situation is. And we are going to discuss inception charts at the same time that we're discussing horary. Please note that horary is very different. It happens upon the moment of asking a question, whereas an inception chart really is just looking at the beginning of when something started. If you start your new job, you're going to start your new job on a certain day at a certain time. And that isn't going to be based on any questions. As a matter of fact, we don't always have any say in that time. We're just asked to be there. So I do want to state that. So we're going to be going into a study of retrogrades. You can see it here, and house rulers. And basically, if the significator is direct, but the house rulers are not, a positive outcome can still happen, but with some delays and difficulties. Realize that any point in time, some of these planets are going to be retrograde, okay? That's natural. And if the retrograde is not happening at the significator, but it is happening to one of the house rulers, something that would be important to that question, then that house ruler does affect that reading, okay? That's really important, and we want to make note of that. Okay, so that brings us to what the retrogrades stand for, okay? So just realize that this part right here is very important. You want to remember that. The study of retrogrades in general is very essential. That's why doing this horary work has been really fun for me, but I also realize the importance because we're reviewing classical rules in astrology, and they don't change. They might vary, they might alter, but they do not change. So let's look at retrogrades. And again, I explained here that the old system didn't recognize them. It's not sun-centered. Okay, it's based in questions. And so I didn't find anything in Barbara Waters' book. I did look because I wanted to do a comparison. But Karen Haymaker is, Hamaker, however we say it, is absolutely more modern day. And so there's a whole couple chapters in there on this. And in the modern system, they are still seen as detrimental. Okay, so that's a real highlight. So I'm going to grab a pen. And that's a real highlight. So I just want to I want to just put a little star there because I think that that is something that astrologers need to understand more is retrogrades. I think that when you're reading charts, retrogrades can be rather stymieing if you're not familiar with them or if you haven't taken any time to really review them. Okay, so now here's the interesting thing about, and this is going to hold true for all retrogrades, all of them, in that if they are favorable for a return of old things or in relationship to things that happen more internally versus externally, okay? So let's look at that. Things like missing people and missing things, because those are the kinds of issues that will often be presented to an astrologer for them to look at. And those things are critical to have those retrogrades because that's exactly what you're going for, is something that's in existence, already happening, okay? They're considered a withholding or a suppression of energy. This factor right here is going to be true regardless of whether you're looking at horary, inception charts, even sometimes in natal charts, because retrogrades do not behave, quote unquote, normally. It's very important to note that. So they're considered a withholding or a suppression of the energy itself. It can indicate that the person or the sign itself is weakened either through things like work or health. So say that the sign is retrograde. Well, then it kind of indicates that the whole thing is weakened. And I got news for you that when planets go retrograde, it does usually incorporate whole signs. And I know that because I'm an asteroid astrologer. And when you get to certain signs, almost everything is retrograde. Okay, so that really is appropriate. Retrogrades are asking us to wait a while before starting something new. They're asking us to reflect on the present situation. And that is going to be true across the field. It doesn't matter if you're talking natal, if you're talking inception, if you're talking event. They are really important that way. The fixed signs, and I kind of like this, Scorpio, Taurus, Aquarius, and Leo, have to begin new eventually, though they, being fixed, don't move until signs move on. Fixed signs, okay, are interesting because they're doers. So it's, to have a retrograde Scorpio or a retrograde in Aquarius is really definitely a little bit more significant, I think, because they really have to move on. They really have to move on. And oftentimes they really have to move on. So a lot of the retrospect can have to do with moving on. So let me move on here. Speaking of which, I just really love that whole idea that fixed signs have to begin new eventually. Like, in other words, they just can't stay with what they're doing. And that's a little tough for those fixed signs. Okay, so significators in retrograde are telling you, an indicator that things are not in their place. They're not where they're supposed to be. They're not happening as they're supposed to, not yet, because things are not, I have a saying when I read the cards sometimes, the players are not on the field, at least not the right players. Okay, so now what we're going to do is, subversion that is not made clear until the planet goes direct, particularly true of planets faster than Saturn. So now we're going to get into this trans-Saturn versus those things that run faster than Saturn. And when you're reading any chart, but particularly horary, you would always begin with the fastest planet. So you really want to know the speeds of the planets that you're working with. So as I move into what was referred to as the trans-Saturn retrograde, okay, and we're going to start with Saturn, okay, since Saturn is our place where you do before Saturn and trans-Saturn. And here we see relates to delays and obstructions that have come from no help from those in charge. The reason why is Saturn is structure. Saturn is the structure. And it's like saying you're not going to get any help from those in charge. It's also the taskmasters, bosses, and things like that. So when it's retrograde, you're not getting any help from those entities. It also talks about, in the beginning, you want to check on your structure or form as well as the strength of the situation, because Saturn is saying to you, look at this. Something here is not right. It's amok, okay? And then it goes on, it says, Saturn retrograde can be overcome, but it does indicate weaknesses and difficulties. Yeah, because especially if it's coming to the end of that retrograde, it can be overcome. All right. Also, because Saturn is generally not a significator, it's not really, the moon usually is, the sun is, but Saturn, unless you're looking truly at the structure of something. Okay. With inception charts, and I do put in parentheses new beginnings so that you would be able to determine that, because I'm going to be getting into what I call astrology lingo. And especially because I really am looking to gather, if you will, people who are really interested in astrology and really want to learn about it. And we are here in the United States. And though you could learn through Kepler College, or you could, designate a private teacher for yourself, many people in this country, many, and since I was a student long before Kepler was even up and running, the university, most of us have been self-taught. And I would have killed for an outlet like YouTube, because I would have been on there every day studying. So take advantage of the format. It's only going to help our cause. So here we are, and it talks about how, in new beginnings, if you're looking at Saturn, okay, and there's a retrograde, it is always going to bring problems and setbacks. Because you're just not going to get the cooperation that you need from the structure, from those in charge. But, the same thing is true, with parents in retrograde Saturn in the natal charts. Is oftentimes there was a parent who might have been more or less ineffectual, is the way I like to put it. Oftentimes when dad isn't around much, or in some cases when the other parent completely takes over. So there's a lot of situations where Saturn retrograde is going to really pop out at you. And that is definitely not something that you really want in an inception chart. Okay, you'd kind of want to wait for that to pass. You want to skip that month, 6 weeks, or whatever it is, okay? Because it's really not going to be good for your situation. And that's on any level, in any kind of chart. Some people are born that way and they can make it work, but that's different when you're referring to natal charts. It is not the same. So let's look at Jupiter retrograde, okay? So in the Jupiter retrograde, we are looking at anything related to higher education, special studies, travel to foreign countries, legal matters, because this is not expansive energy, not externally. And I'm going to say that with quotations, okay? Not externally, all right? So if we look at, so there's no expansion with the retrograde Jupiter, okay? I'm going to put a Jupiter so that you know. And Jupiter retrograde would always come with an R. Not working with a pen today, a real pen, so we have to, big computer doesn't have that. So here we have an example of inception. So I'm going to give you some inceptions, because apparently Karen's done a lot of work with people like politicians. And, it's kind of interesting because as an astrologer, when somebody does run that I'm interested in, we do look at when they throw their hat in the ring. That's not just me, that's anybody. When you're looking at the beginning of a campaign, I kind of like looking at those charts, because I have this thing about looking at people's charts that I don't have permission to look at. Now, if you're a public figure, that goes without saying. You kind of put yourself out there. But I still try to abide by the integrity of astrology, which is you don't do stuff like that. However, if you're talking about throwing your hat in the ring, you're talking about a moment, an event. Look at that, and you can see how the political campaign is going to go. In this case, she's talking about how somebody in this position will fail. There'll be no popularity. The popularity will drop. But this is also for artists, musicians. So if you're an artist, do not promote your work while Jupiter is retrograde. The same would be true of a music release. Not a good idea. So if you happen to be a musician or an artist, check in with astrology. It's really easy to know if something is retrograde, okay? Or call me, okay? That's what my clients do. And, that's something that I provide as a service, because I don't want people to fail. I want them to succeed. So Jupiter is, however, considered benevolent action, but when it's retro, it withholds benevolent actions. And that is something that is really worth looking at. As a person who does predictive astrology, and I do sometimes my own charts, you see Jupiter at the descendant and you're like, yes, because it means you can get what you ask for. And then you notice that it's retrograde. And even though those people that you're dealing with might still be cheerful, humorous, you may not be getting anything from them. I think that was understandable. Okay. However, Jupiter is a very spiritual planet, and it is great for any inner development. It's helpful in spiritual matters or self-intuition. Do you want to start meditating? If you do, wait for Jupiter to be retro, and I think that would just enhance any meditation that you're going to do and could help you set up a really good practice for down the road. So I definitely endorse meditation. I'm a meditator and I swear by it. So if you're interested in it, you're not quite sure, think your mind wanders too much, try it during a retrograde Mercury or a retrograde Jupiter. And I think that you'll find you have a different experience. If you can get both planets retrograde, power to you, because I think that it could help set you up for a very good meditative practice. Okay. So I'm going to move to the next planet here, which is Mars. And Mars is action. So it's obvious what this is going to mean in retrograde. It means inaction. Okay. So your action is inhibited. Now, what's interesting is on a Mars retrograde, what could be inhibiting the action is the actual person who's asking the question or the actual person who's doing the inception or beginning, the new beginning. So I'm going to use those words and until we get to know them, like a second language, because astrology is another language. And one of the beauties of doing these videos is that I get to speak astrology. And it's a really wonderful thing. I used to have astrology buddies where we would make up words with our asteroids, what it means, like a Sirius Zeus or a Mercury Zeus would be a cigarette, because it has a fire, and it's in one place, Sirius is considered the food or a nurturing thing, and the Mercury is considered an oral thing. So just some fun things you could do with astrology. For us, it's going to be learning the language of retrograde and stationary today because they're really important. And the other one is peregrine. Now, I'll write that down. I'm going to only give that at the very end, hopefully remember, because all that is it means the planet that is not being aspect. As a matter of fact, let me see if I can. Let's put you on hold for a second. Let me come up with the word so we can see what it looks like in case you run into it. So here I've written it, I've taken it from the book, so it's spelled correctly. There's a couple words. There's another one we're going to be doing today too, pronation. And these are not words that they're going to be able to do in spell check. I had to add them all to the dictionary because once again, there's a language going on in astrology that is not spoken by everybody. Okay. So here it is, peregrine. Okay. And what it means is that it's a planet in a chart that has no aspects. And since we don't work with asteroids or trans-Neptunians in the classical astrology, there's a lot of times when you might find that a planet is peregrine. Okay? So I just wanted to get to that and kind of explain it. Let me go back up where we were. And I was working with Mars is where we were going. Okay, here we are. So Mars is about action. All right. And inaction or being inhibited would be a Mars retrograde. Now, it means that if you do use this for an inception chart, which new beginnings, or if you find this in a horary chart, what it means is that starting things that tend to be left undone or are spoiled by impatience and being too rash or impulsive. Yes, it's that negative aspect of the energy of Mars because that's what tends to happen during the retrograde. Okay. And then it goes on and I talk about in the inception chart, and this is again quoted right from her book, the Mars indicates not being recognized. No matter how hard you work, if you took a job and you started the job on a day that Mars happened to be retrograde, you would never be recognized in that job, no matter how hard you worked. And you could work very hard and just be overlooked with that energy. So that is an important concept right there. Politicians who begin their campaigns during Mars retrograde don't get anywhere. Others are resistant, no matter how good their intentions are. Here we go again. No matter how good they are, Mars retrograde doesn't do them any favors. Mars in retrograde tends to create trouble. In operations, it can cause more bleeding and blood loss, not necessarily death. So please note that. That same is going to be true with accidents. You know, when you buy a new car and if it's a Mars retrograde, you're going to dent that car. There's no two ways about it. Mars retrograde does indicate dents. It can also indicate accidents where there could be blood loss. But here again, not necessarily death. Okay? That's really important to note. But I like this part. It indicates that the car is going to be dented a good deal. So dents are certain. Okay? These are just things that if we knew these things, we could make better consumers. We would do our shopping when it's more appropriate. We would begin jobs when it's more appropriate. I think it's really sad that we got away from astrology because the founding fathers of this country all knew their astrology, at least enough to set things up in a way that caused things to go easier. It's only in more recent history that all of that has been given up. And it's rather sad because it sets us up to be more vulnerable than we would be if we had the knowledge that we once had. So my goal is to put that knowledge back out there. So people like you and me and anybody else we can share this information with doesn't have to make those same mistakes. So as we move on, this is, of course, Mars, not good for marriages. It's really bad for marriages because it really will affect your sex life. Okay, that's not a great place because it can indicate sexual problems in a relationship. You know, I like this too. Mars retrograde is asking you to finish what you're already doing. You know, the problem with Mars is it's a very impulsive energy, and it does give way to being so impulsive and rash that there is this sense of not finishing what you're doing before you go on to the next thing. You want to be very wary of that because that is the impulsive actions of that Mars. So you want to wait for things, you know, you want to finish what you're doing and begin nothing until Mars and Venus and Mercury are very important when they're retrograde, and it's well worth understanding what you can and can't do during those times just to avoid problems down the road. So speaking of Venus, let's go to Venus. Okay, as with all planets, external is always inhibited. True, if someone's asking about their relationship will lead to marriage. So you go to a horary astrologer, or you go to an astrologer who does horary, and you say to the astrologer, hey, I'm involved with this guy, but are we ever going to get married? And Venus happens to be retrograde. Oh, no, not good. Now, if this is about a relationship where a woman comes or a man and goes to the horary astrologer and says, I am really having troubles in my marriage. Are we going to be able to sort this out? Now that Venus retrograde, that means something completely different. And yes, you probably will. So again, it's about what is already in process. Are you discussing a relationship that's already ongoing? Is the financial situation you're asking about already ongoing? If it is, then that Venus retrograde, no problems. Okay? But if you decide that you're going into a negotiation or an agreement, it won't be kept. Peace treaties that occur during the time of Venus retrogrades, I wish more politicians understood this, won't be kept. Somebody's going to blow it. So it's really interesting that we know all this information, yet the people who are our leaders don't seem to know this information. And look how much it affects everything. Okay, so one of the things that you want to do here, and I'm going to just pull up a pen for this, is you got to look at the two energies. So in Venus, it's ruled by two sources. One is Taurus, and in Taurus, it's about finances. Okay, well, they all are, but it heavily relates to banks, to loans, to institutions. And here again, they will not be helpful. They will not be supportive if that Venus is retrograde. Okay, so we're looking at the energy of Taurus, which is financial, material, if you will. With Libra, okay, that energy is more related to relationships, art, creative projects. And I'll be honest with you, if it's a Venus retrograde and it's a creative project, there could be a lot of self-enjoyment here. There could be a lot of purpose. The whole factor, though, especially, again, as it relates to Libra, because I'm doing them as they relate to these two signs. In Libra, it is wonderful if you do a project where you do not have to depend on anyone. And most artists don't. Okay, they don't have to depend on anyone. So working on a piece of art or a project that's creative during this time, as long as you do not have to depend on another individual, that's wonderful. The action being internal, not external. Very key. Okay, that's like a mantra when you're dealing with anything related to retrogrades, but particularly the horary. If it's external and it's retrograde, probably not so good. But if it's internal and it's retrograde, that could be good. Okay, so moving on, we're going to look at Mercury retrograde. Remember I said to you the three retrogrades, well, especially Mercury, Mars, and Venus, the three, because they're faster moving planets. They really can blow things up if they're not done with these retros in mind. Mercury retrograde, lots of things. Mercury retrograde is terrible for any form of communication, and I do not care whether it's the inception of something or if it's a horary chart of something, or I don't care what it is. Mercury retrograde is about thinking retrospect. It's about reviewing. It's people who have retrograde Mercuries natally are often very intuitive people. It only stands to reason. It's internal. They don't have to depend on an external circumstance. So here we have, it indicates changes of mind. So here it could be the person who's even asking the question might decide to change, just like Mars, just like Venus. So again, those three, they're tricky. These are the ones that are faster. Everything Jupiter and up toward Venus, Mercury, which is the fastest, those are the before Saturn, not the trans Saturns, okay? So change of minds, huge, okay, especially in a horary. Drastic review of policy. Well, that's actually what Mercury retrograde is really for. But do you understand how that can affect a horary chart? Do you understand how that can affect an inception? It's going to change everything because the policy is going to change. Okay. The risk of misunderstandings. Well, if you don't already know that, whew. Okay. Wrong interpretations. Yeah. Yes. Or as an astrologer, you know, when I am interpreting something, I have to be very careful that I don't forget something or I don't gloss over something that's more important. It's breaches of contract. Yeah, you know, they're not going to honor it any more than the Venus retrograde. Partners, more than one, could be fraudulent. So there's not even any knowing of who to blame here because it could be many sources to blame. often it indicates that there's something wrong with the question. That's where I would be playing this as an astrologer. I would be very concerned with even taking any astrology, this kind of astrology, not if I'm doing a chart for somebody, because it takes me weeks to get through a chart, and that retrospect that I'd be working through, that might be really good. So, but here again, I'd have to be careful of wrong interpretations. But again, it's easy to kind of put things off if you can. It's not stupid to do that. Or do some reflection during that retro, but really kind of put the thing together when it moves direct. The other thing here is, again, like all planets here, it's a great time for self-evaluation, and that intuition, that's what it's really for, and that's how we should be using it. So I look at these retrogrades and I say, they're just gifts if we learn how to use them. So it's just another way of getting a gift. Now, the last part of this is if Mercury turns retrograde a few days later, meaning after the question has been asked. So it's really careful. You have to be really careful when you ask these questions. Then the person can change their mind. They could even let the matter completely drop. Yeah, because as you come close to the retrograde, it still has an effect on you. Now let's talk about stationary. Oh yes, and I always want to do this. You know, I really believe, let me come up here, that the any planet, and I just think this is true of anything, okay, that you want to make sure that right here, okay, looking at Mercury it gives how it's aspected is going to be critical to how you read it too. The same with Saturn, the same with Jupiter, the same. Any planet is going to come with some aspects unless it's peregrine. And we already talked about that, which means it doesn't have any aspects. But here's an interesting concept that also applies to stationary planets. And it's called reformation, okay? And trust me when I tell you, these words are not in the computer. So you almost have to go check your spellings and then add them to your dictionaries, okay? Reformation happens when two significators are in aspect to one another, but one leaves, usually the faster one. Because here again, always read the faster one first, because one of them is going to leave. It's usually always the faster one. Leaves the sign before the full aspect can be reached or completed. For example, something's coming into a conjunction. And Mercury's riding up to this conjunction of Uranus. And you're riding up there and bam, stops 2 degrees before it gets there. It retros. It's just the way it is, you know, like sometimes these things happen. That retro is going to affect that situation. There it is. Okay. And these aspects, you know, especially the significators and the house rulers, they're really critical to what will eventually materialize from this specific situation. And it just can't happen. So when you're reading the significators, you would always start with the faster. And when the faster turns retro, if it happens before the aspect is full, it's like a promise broken. Okay, because what happens is by the time it comes back, oftentimes the other planet has now changed signs. And that's called reformation. Okay, the interesting thing is it doesn't always happen like that. Sometimes it retrogrades, and if you're willing to be patient and wait the 6 weeks, it will come back and still aspect that slow-moving planet, but maybe it takes 8 weeks to do that. But what happens is oftentimes is during the 8 weeks that another sign will then leave the sign completely, and once it leaves the sign, it's completely lost. Okay, so it won't make an aspect in that situation. So that's another new word besides stationary. Okay, now stationary, just getting back to it, I skipped it on purpose. Stationary occurs when a planet is slowing down either right before the retrograde or right after the retrograde. It goes into what we call almost a still period. It is marked in software by an S, which would replace the R. Okay, so it does tell you in the softwares. All right, and when something is slowed down, it slows so slow that it seems like it's not moving at all, it is called stationary. So it does make sense. Since they are said to be standing still, they cannot be applied by aspect to any other planet because they're not moving. In order to be an aspect, it has to be in action. It has to be moving. Okay? It's referred to as blocks of concrete because they can be an indication that the querent, the person who's asking the question, another new word, is not flexible or compliant. That's what that means, okay? I'll give you an example. Take somebody who might have, and Chronos is not used in Horary, but let's use Chronos for an example because there'll be a lot of these. Chronos, because it's really slow to begin with, stationary period might be a little bit more of a stationary period than some other planets. And stationary means, in Chronos' case, that person is uncompromising and very likely will not work in any situations unless they get to be the authority or the person in charge. It's just the way it is, okay? Well, it applies also when you're looking at it in this way, that it would be a block. You can't move it forward, okay? But I do want to stress, Chronos is a trans-Neptunian, so it would not be used in Horary. However, it would be used in inception charts. Okay, so, all right. I explained what the here we go. Refrenation is, okay? In any of these situations, okay, in any of the situations of reformation, it means that the situation eventually does not materialize, no matter how much it looks like you're headed in the right direction. A planet turning retrograde can be an indication of someone turning their back. It's like somebody walked away. It's like, hey, we're in this deal. Oh, now we're not, because somebody walked away. A change of signs could be a change of minds in both parties, unlike regular astrology. When Horary leaves its sign, it's over. It's done. A change of, okay. So it brings external situations to a halt. Here, the planet aspects can only indicate why it was brought to a halt. In other words, you can go look it up. You could probably get more detail as to the whys and the wherefores, but that's what it's going to be. Okay? Talks about how reformation can rob people of something they were really looking forward to. I totally understand that on levels that I can't even really share with you, okay? But let's just say, been there, done that, all right? It's a warning here to remember that you can't reach too much into any horary charts. Let me give you an example of the yogi, okay? So I'm going to give you an example right from the book. I thought this was fabulous because this is exactly how Horary works. I know from experience because I have dabbled in Horary. I understand reformation, the reformation because, oh, wow, I've lived it, okay? The same thing, let's talk about the example of the yogi. So this man who is a yogi goes to a woman and he's asking a question about getting recognition from the hierarchy of the yogis that he works with. I don't know how many people are familiar with yoga, but there usually is of some kind of hierarchy, a reigning yogi. Like if it's Iyengar, it would have been Iyengar. I think now his wife or daughter, somebody's doing it. He's no longer with us, but somebody's continuing his legacy. I do know that I studied Baptiste for a really long time. So Baptiste heads his own yogi, and he has his minions underneath him and then underneath him. Anyway, he wanted to get recognition from a hierarchy, and that's what he went to ask about. And the chart was not good. It had a lot of retros. It had Saturn. He would not get recognition from the powers that be. However, he had a yoga studio that was incredibly successful. And by the way, it was still successful because the question had nothing to do with his business, not his personal business. It had to do with his recognition within the hierarchy. That's how exacting these charts are. That's how much we need to pinpoint the questions and how much that question does not relate to the overall picture. This man was incredibly successful. He didn't really need the hierarchy. He just didn't. But that wasn't really reflected in that chart. What was reflected in the chart was that he wouldn't really get the recognition that he wanted. There were disappointments in there. And so it was really an interesting little story. So let me come back. So it's really an interesting idea to really look at the difference of a planet that's going direct and one that is in retrograde. I think that the lesson is far beyond horary. I think that it extends to any astrology that we do, that it is well worth taking a look at the retrogrades, just like it's well worth looking at tarot cards in reverse because of the way they can enhance and add detail. The same thing is true of retrogrades, but the difference is that retrogrades can really tell you whether something's going to work or not. And it doesn't fail, unfortunately. So I can tell you that from my long experience as an astrologer. So once again, thank you all for being here and for helping me build this channel and for listening through some of this rather dry information that I find incredibly fascinating, and I hope you do too. So I'm going to leave you, as I always do, that I want to wish you only happy readings, and hopefully until we meet again, take care, be well, and mostly in this day and age, be safe.